Welcome to C2GLearn Campfire Chat. Today's chat focuses on the introduction to governance of solar radiation modification. Thank you for joining the sessions from the various time zones you're in, like our panelists is from the Far East to the Far West. Now, C2GLearn topics consist of two events. The webinar session, where the learning opportunity is to understand the science, the knowledge, what the issues are. And then the campfire chats, like the one of today, where the learning opportunity for you is to understand how different experts approach the various issues and think about it by taking some particular examples out of the many issues which are existing out there. So our sessions here are not to argue and to convince each other, but they are to explain the why, the factors to consider, understand the perspectives. So the views we are hearing are clearly those of our guests, and our role of C2G is to facilitate your learning of these kind of perspectives. We have today four amazing people joining us, and we will understand later who this is. They will introduce themselves. Let me continue to say just a few words of solar radiation modification approaches, because as I mentioned, we have the webinars and we have learning materials, and then there are many learning materials out there for many different actors which are increasingly engaging into the exercise. But of course, there will be gaps, and also we will understand some of that later on. But it's important to understand that, and as you will learn as well, these approaches would not address the causes of climate change, but and there are therefore no substitute for reducing or removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now, with regard to how these campfires are organized, we have 2 rounds of interaction with the guests, followed by the question and answer sessions where you have the opportunity to bring in the questions. And for this, a few important things I have to mention to you. We are going to record all the questions in a question and answer interface, which you're seeing on your Zoom interface. Please inject your questions in there. We have a colleague, Paul Roos, our science advisor, who is sitting in the background and going to look at all those questions, digest them, and bring them to our attention. So you can also support a question which you have seen by voting for particular questions. Importantly, do not use the chat box for questions. They will not be captured. With this, let's turn to the first round of working with our visitors. I'm too much still in a physical world, so to say. We have each of them have been asked to quickly introduce themselves and then pick an issue which helps us understand their perspective, as I mentioned. And I shall start with Thelma Krug. Thelma, may I ask you to start with your first intervention?
Yes, thank you very much, Kai. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Thelma Krug. I am one of the vice chairs of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Ipcc. So my contribution to this campfire chat will be based on the scientific findings or the scientific products that have been assessed by the Ipcc, mainly on the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius that was approved in October 2018. So it's quite recent. And since the Ipcc assesses the global literature, 2018 brought updated findings related to this topic. But in the Ipcc fifth assessment report in 2013-2014, Ipcc also included a session on solar radiation modification and also on carbon dioxide removals, which are climate-altering approaches. And in this special campfire chat, we will concentrate on solar radiation modification. But it's important also to note that in the next assessment report of the Ipcc, the 6th one, which is planned to be published in 2021-2022, we are going to have in Chapter 4 of the contribution of Working Group 1, which works on the physical basis of climate change, a session that is specifically focused on the climate response to solar radiation management scenarios. So in the Ipcc 1.5 special report, the Ipcc assessed several greenhouse gas emission pathways. These are model trajectories of global anthropogenic emissions. And these trajectories consistent to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Some of these pathways were overshoot pathways that really exceeded the temperature of 1.5 before the 2100, and then being brought down to 1.5 by the end of this century. So the IPCC then acknowledges the potential need to have carbon dioxide removal approaches and also solar radiation modification as supplementary to the very ambitious mitigation efforts that need to be done to limit global warming to 1.5. Also, the IPCC special report acknowledges the uncertainties around the solar radiation modification approaches, including the technological maturity, physical understanding. So we have several issues that I think we are going to have the opportunity to discuss here further with the contribution of all those friends that are here participating in this Campfire Chat. So thank you very much, Kai, and that's it for me now.
Thank you, Thelma. Thanks for these points you just made. I will just, with no further ado, turn to Jesse, if you could share your affiliations and introduce yourself and your points. Thank you.
Yes, gladly. I'm Jesse Reynolds. I'm an Emmett Frankel Fellow in Environmental Law and Policy at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law. And in general, my research concerns the governance where environment and technology intersect, emerging technologies and environmental issues. In my book, The Governance of Solar Geoengineering, was published last year on Cambridge University Press. I want to say a little bit about what motivates me to think about the governance of SRM, solar radiation modification, and what I think the next step needs to be. The unfortunate fact is that emissions cuts and carbon dioxide removal, CDR, will most likely not be able to keep warming within 1.5 degrees C and probably not 2 degrees Celsius as well. And if so, then the addition of SRM as a supplement will be the only way to make this goal. And what's more, unlike emissions cuts and CDR, SRM seems uniquely able to reduce climate change quickly if necessary. But on the other hand, it's well known that SRM could be disastrous environmentally and or politically, especially if it's poorly implemented and poorly governed. So let's look ahead and work our way backwards. We could reach 1.5 degrees warming by mid-century. So one could imagine that SRM might be beneficial by then. Now, 30 years from now might seem like a long time, but we want international governance in place well before then. And that will require substantial, lengthy global discussions that thus must begin even sooner. Furthermore, doing SRM responsibly 30 years from now will require substantial expansion and internationalization of research. So governance of research, including facilitating it, is also a fairly urgent matter. Now, in the governance of both the use and the research of SRM, it's important that the discussions be informed and built upon evidence that fairly considers all the relevant advantages and disadvantages at hand, just as they should when we consider any response to climate change. Now, I'm concerned, though, that SRM's limitations and risks are often foregrounded while the risks of not pursuing SRM are overlooked. So I think increasingly so that the next step is internationally authoritative scientific assessment of SRM. And it seems to me that the IPCC is the place for this. I'm glad that Dr. Krug brought up both the special report 1.5 and the forthcoming AR6. But of course, given the limited space in AR6, as well as the learning curve to get up to speed on SRM, I think that a special report on SRM from the IPCC after the AR6 cycle would be wise. And such an assessment needs to be led by SRM experts who can provide the requisite knowledge and background to make it a well-informed, evidence-based, successful assessment. Thanks.
Thank you, Jesse, for this intervention. Let me turn over to Shuchi Talati, if you could just pursue.
Yes, thanks so much, Kai, and thank you for having me on this Campfire Chat. Hi, everyone. My name is Shuchi Talati. I was most recently at the Union of Concerned Scientists, a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., where I worked on solar geoengineering, research governance, and public engagement. So as you might infer from that, a key issue in governance for me is public engagement in solar geoengineering research, specifically atmospheric experiments. And so I think the main question in governance asks is, should solar geoengineering experiments proceed? And if so, under what conditions? And so I think three major parts of those conditions are mechanisms for oversight, transparency, and engagement. So engagement can encompass a myriad of types of processes, right? It can involve informing people, understanding their preferences, soliciting their input, collaborating with them, and then empowering them to make decisions. So for solar geoengineering research, we need all of these types of processes at different points in the research timeline and at different scales. And so this kind of participation isn't just necessary under democratic ideals, but also provides a form of legitimate societal review. And even almost more importantly, can also provide diverse perspectives and ideas in the research process that may not be apparent to the researchers themselves. And so this is an important issue that is coming into play now. So SCOPEX, or the Stratosphere Controlled Perturbation Experiment, is a proposed experiment that would entail a balloon dispersing a few kilograms of aerosols in the stratosphere. So the researchers would then monitor how those released aerosols behave and their chemistry. So this experiment itself poses negligible direct risk, but its prominence as precedent setting and the inherent intentionality towards larger experiments have drawn quite a bit of attention. And so because of that attention, an independent advisory committee was established to help provide those three core components of governance I mentioned before: oversight, transparency, and engagement. And so I sit on this committee, and we are thinking through engagement carefully now. And as you can imagine, it is quite challenging. And so what we are currently thinking about is having different engagement processes at different geographical scales, with different processes varying in type as we move from local to global. It's a complex process, but really motivates me in thinking about how we can do this in a legitimate way for the first time in an applied setting. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Shuchi. And with no further ado, over to Arunabha for your introduction and points. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai-Uwe, and good day to all of you. It's about early evening in India out here. Thank you for listening in. I'm Arunabha Ghosh. I'm the CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water, which is an independent think tank based in India, but we operate across emerging markets across the world. I have been engaged on SRM and overall climate engineering governance for about a decade now. In 2010, I co-chaired the International Governance Working Group for the Royal Society's Solar Radiation Management Governance Initiative. Why am I interested in this conversation? It starts with that very simple question: why are we thinking about SRM in the first place? And to me, these questions are not just scientific ones, but there's the underlying politics of it has to be understood. And there's no right answer. The question that emerges in my mind is SRM going to be treated as a last resort? Or is it going to be used as a first resort by countries or groups of countries that are perhaps not mitigating emissions sufficiently? Is this a way simply to buy time before we figure out better ways and more sustainable ways to get onto a more sustainable emissions pathway? Or could it be simply a response to localized emergencies, for instance, rapid melting in the Arctic? That question of why then raises the question about what are the incentives that various actors could have to pursue this line of inquiry? Is it simply the relative lower cost of pursuing SRM approaches compared to other potentially more expensive ways of mitigating emissions? Or could it be simply an incentive to signal one's intention to pursue this if other countries, other regions do not get serious about dealing with mitigating emissions? Could there be an incentive in trying to establish technological lead in an emerging and potentially dangerous, but also potentially beneficial area of technologies? Or is the simple incentive that for a small country that perhaps is getting overcome by climate emergencies, this is the only option left when no one else is stepping up to help? Therefore, the question that comes in my mind is, who might act on this area, and is national governance going to be enough? And in many of my writings and my lectures, I've articulated that there are many scenarios that could play out. It could be privately funded research. It could be a small group of countries. It could be a large group of countries acting on an SRM research agenda. Or it could be a unilateral measure by a single large country, or even a small island state or a small developing country, as I said earlier, faced by a climate emergency. All of these scenarios and all of these whys and the incentives lead us with this big question: is national governance enough, or what kind of international governance is necessary? And currently, we have a very thin layer of international governance, some statements by the Convention on Biological Diversity, and some ways in which the mandates of various other international regimes, whether it's the UNFCCC, whether it's the Montreal Protocol, whether it is the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, and so forth, which could have potentially some implication in governance. But nothing is established, nothing is clear. So it is for resolving some of those questions that I want to participate in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Arunabha. Thank you very much, all four of you, for your opening statements. We shall be moving in a second into the second round, where we are just diving a bit more into the why, who, where, gaps, risks. Again, picking a particular view, not comprehensively, but I wanted to just reiterate to our audience that you can ask the questions, pose them now, whenever they come to your mind, throw them into your question and answer interface. My colleague Paul is kind of feeling eager to get some input and to be able to help us afterwards with the Q&A, to make sure that you get answers or feedback to questions you might have in your mind. And there's no, as I would typically say, there's no stupid questions. At best, there are stupid answers. Sorry, guys, I put you possibly into a wrong space here. Now, let's move on maybe on to that second round of interventions of your sides. Of our experts here is, we will basically address here the, as I said, the why it's important, who should be involved, where should the discussions take place, and we've heard sound bites and views around this already in the first round. So maybe we can start again, Arunabha. You have a second opportunity right up there. First is to why? I say it for 4 times. Why should one get engaged now? What are, from your perspective, if you had 2 points to make, what would they be, so to say, or 3 points? What would it be? Thank you.
Thank you again. It feels like I'm coming back straight after the midpoint of a football match. I have 3 points to make why we should be thinking about this now. What can we know about SRM? What do we not know or not know enough about? And somewhat related to what Shuchi was saying, how can we build the transparency that can then reduce the risk and increase public trust in this area of research? Now, what can we know? I argued earlier that we can have a range of reasons why certain countries or scientists or group of countries could be pursuing this. But what do we need to know more is, how will this be deployed? Shuchi referred to one particular experiment underway, but stratospheric aerosol injection is one category of SRM. So how how are these methods going to be deployed? And then we need to know a lot more about how much each of these is going to cost. We have some estimates about this, and there's a lot of literature around them, but these are still very much in the realm of trying to understand or guess what the cost might be. A very important question about what can we know is how long do we have to do this? If we started off on SRM, is there an exit opportunity at all, or do we have to keep running it for decades on to avoid a springback of the temperature rise? But what do we not know or not know enough about is, again, around these issues of what are the incentives that different actors might have, but also, and I think Jesse will talk about this a little bit, but what are the underlying risks? Again, we have a lot of speculation around it. There is a lot of research going on, but the localized understanding of the risks, what would it mean for South Asia versus East Africa, is going to be something much more important for us to consider, along with what do we not know that we not know? What are the unknown unknowns? So therefore, I think the issue of transparency to reduce a sense of risk and increase trust becomes critical. Transparency is a common principle for any kind of major scientific endeavor. And there are enough historical precedents of international research collaborations embedding that principle of transparency front and center. But what all do we need transparency for? We need transparency for the research idea specifically. We need transparency for the individual types of methods that are being attempted. We need transparency certainly about any kind of outdoor experiments. We need transparency about who's funding, again, with what incentives. And is there any merit or demerit of private versus government funding? And of course, we need transparency about the outcomes, but outcomes from the point of view, not just of the primary objective of, say, reducing the amount of solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface, but the localized impacts again. So these are very much questions that we should begin to talk about now, so that we have some of the foundational principles ready to build over time a governance architecture that aligns with the evolution of the science.
Thank you very much, Arunabha. I'm pretty sure we have questions building up, and I see they have been happening from in the question and answer interface. And yeah, again, this round will be not reacting to each other, but I think with the question and answers and in the second phase of this chat, so to say, we'll also be able to have you interact with each other, because I see everyone very attentive listening, and I think thinking, okay, what's my view on that? So we'll get to this. Let me then turn to Thelma. If you maybe can share the around the who, the where, the gaps, what your thoughts are.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Kai. Yeah, knowledge gaps have been already identified in the fifth assessment report. And there, because it was in 2013, 14, they mentioned the gaps of gaps in understanding, and mainly the scarcity of studies and the diversity of model designs, experimental designs, which were difficult to do a intercomparison between them because they were different. So it was difficult to make an assessment of the efficacy and the side effects. That was in 2013, 2014. Now, I think that we have progressed in terms of our understanding, especially in the stratosphere injection, aerosol injection, which is one of the most researched methods in SRM. The other ones still remain, there's lots of knowledge gaps. But I make reference to one of the tables in the 1.5 special report, which addresses knowledge gaps and uncertainties. It's table 4.13 for those that are interested. And basically they mentioned the following, that in spite of the increasing attention to the different solar radiation modification measures, and also their potential to keep global temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius, knowledge gaps still remain, not only with respect to the physical understanding of the SRM measures, but also concerning ethical issues. Another point that they make is that we still do not know how to govern, and I think this point has already been explored in our conversation so far. So how to govern the SRM in order to avoid unilateral action and how to prevent possible reductions in mitigation. And I would also raise one issue that is not in the table, but is the risk of termination shock, as they say, or the termination effect of SRM, when you suddenly stop the SRM, which might then cause rapid temperature rise and associated impacts, most noticeably biodiversity loss. So this is one aspect that really scares everybody, because we are talking here about sustaining, these measures or these approaches for a long time. So the issue of, who pays for that, who ensuring the governance, and also possibly with the implementation, we will understand better the potential risks or the risks that might have been observed, in particular regional risks that might be affecting in particular developing countries, but not exclusively, obviously. So I would say that these are the main points that I would relate to the knowledge gaps. Still a lot to be understood. Like to reinforce the fact that, not all the approaches have been studied in the same depth. So there is a lot still to be learned on the other measures and their implications and potential risks. Thank you.
Thank you, Thelma. Shuchi, what are your thoughts around these questions of who, where, and gaps?
Yeah, I think when it comes to who, I think it's a really key question, right? And as Arunabha and Thelma were saying, there's so much that we still don't know. There's quite a bit of uncertainty around everything around SRM approaches. And so given that uncertainty, I think we need to have really diverse input into decision-making around deployment, but also around research. And so I think this input is especially important to have from climate vulnerable communities and nations. And I think a key issue that's currently limiting that participation is capacity building. And I think we need to have, a lot more discussion on how to do that. I think we have a responsibility to help build both scientific and governance capacity in nations and communities to help them participate in these conversations. And so when we talk about who, I want to say I want full participation of the public, but we have to enable them to have that conversation too.
Thank you. Jesse, I think if you could come in, we've heard, I think, a little bit, the questions about risks and your thinking about risks on the subject matter. Thank you.
Yeah, the risk that I'd like to focus on is what's sometimes called the moral hazard concern. And this is the concern that attention to the research and development of SRM will draw resources and attention away from the necessary emissions cuts that continue to be insufficient. And it's true that in the long run, greenhouse gas emissions cuts are the only way to reduce and eliminate climate change. And for that reason, such mitigation must remain central. At the same time, I increasingly believe that this concern is actually leading perhaps to greater climate risk. And this can be a little counterintuitive, so I want to explain how. In a world of limited resources, everything can displace everything else. And in the case of climate, it's not just that investing in SRM might reduce investments in emissions cuts, but investing in adaptation could also reduce mitigation. And in fact, that was a major concern in the late 90s and early 2000s until vulnerable countries pushed that up the agenda of the international climate change communities. And investments in CDR could reduce attention to other options. And in fact, investment and attention to mitigation will reduce investment and attention to adaptation, CDR, and SRM. So the question shouldn't be whether X would distract from Y, but what is the right mix of investments of our money, of our time, and of our expertise? And in this, we need to remember that the goal, it should be to reduce climate change and its impacts, not simply to reduce emissions. That's a means to an end. So where are we? Despite being at the top of the agenda, the top priority for 30 years, progress in cutting greenhouse gas emissions has consistently been woefully insufficient. And I don't see any reason to think the next 30 years will be somehow dramatically different. And meanwhile, this concern, the so-called moral hazard concern about attention to SRM interfering with emissions cuts, has hindered SRM research since the very beginning. In fact, it was the source of controversy about the first, as far as I know, formal consideration of SRM and other climate intervention technologies in the 1992 U.S. National Academies report. So here we are 30 years later. And SRM, as I said in my opening statement, appears to be necessary as a complement to staying within internationally agreed upon warming goals. And it still receives this tiny fraction of research funding. By my ballpark math, it's something like a couple % of 1% of total climate change funding. Yet emissions cuts remain so low that we're worried that they would be further reduced, further interfered with, and that's inhibiting what I see as valuable resource. So I'm concerned that this implicit widespread faith that zero carbon energy and dramatic behavioral change is just around the corner this time is getting in the way of clearly thinking about how we can best reduce climate change impacts, especially for the most vulnerable peoples and ecosystems on the planet.
Thank you, Jesse. These were clearly a set of interventions which also started questions popping up from the audience. So I'm sure that you would have reactions to what you each other said and share additional arguments or thoughts and perspectives. But maybe we turn first to the questions from the audience, and please keep asking questions because I have at least 3 here which are going to be interesting to answer. With that, we turn to one. Here, one question is it too early to argue the case for the technologies as solutions when the governance framework is not yet available? What comes first, proven technology or robust governance? That's one. And maybe I'm throwing out a second one. What are the panel's thoughts about the problem of not knowing what the impacts of SRM would be, and that without full-scale experiments, we cannot know what those impacts may be? I would want to make one quick point is that we are referring very often in these conversations, terminology is not 100% fixed. People are using the same abbreviations by meaning different things. Solar radiation modification is a basket name, if you wish, for all kinds of different, significantly different technologies and approaches, ranging from what often is equated to be the same as solar stratospheric aerosol injection of particles into the atmosphere, to methods of changing the color of the ground of Earth, whether this is paneling, painting roofs white, or changing crops and hence the color of the Earth's surface. So just maybe in responses, maybe we can differentiate. Just be clear is that the response is about SAI or it is about marine cloud brightening and so forth. So let me. Should I repeat the question? I think you all took note, right? So maybe who would like to react first to the question maybe about what comes first, proven technology or robust governance, or maybe we need to clarify what is understood by governance, because governance for many people means many things. And again, one of the challenges of our emerging conversation, so is that we have all different understandings of terms. And Ipcc has a governance understanding, which we at C2G also, I think, embrace, which is the whole processes and activities which are taking place to reach conclusions and actions in societies. This is a very big paraphrase, but it's not what often is understood, a rulemaking by government which is limiting action. And so these are basically kind of the two extremes of understanding. So having said this, who wants to volunteer to react to that question? What's first, technology or governance?
I think I can start that and that be complemented by my friends. Because I think this is an interesting question. So it's difficult to say what comes first, and I think that these things come together. But anyway, let's come back to the Ipcc, and I think that there are a couple of things in the Ipcc special report which brings, which really highlights the importance of us discussing these things. Well, one thing is we are trying to, from the Paris Accord, we are trying to pursue limiting global warming to 1.5. So it's well below the 2 degrees Celsius and pursuing the 1.5, which for some especially the insular countries, it's already too much. But anyway, one of the findings of the Ipcc, which were interesting to see, was that the Ipcc, in the literature assessment of the 1.5, one of the findings is that limiting global warming to 1.5 is not impossible, but it requests that you have unprecedented changes in all areas of society. So when we're talking about unprecedented changes, we're talking a huge mitigation effort, including in all the pathways that IPCC have assessed, to limit global warming to 1.5 by the end of the century. All of them, the CO2 emissions around 2050 had to drop to net zero, as we say, right? To net zero CO2 emissions, right? And in parallel, you would have also reductions in other non-CO2, but not reaching zero, because these are a little bit more complicated. So in these pathways, so you see the challenge that we have before us. At some point we would have to have net zero, and all pathways that we assess 2050, around 2050. And obviously in some of the pathways or trajectories that could lead us to limit global warming to 1.5, in some of them you go smoothly, possibly smoothly, with a lot of mitigation going, in the limit to 1.5, which we call no overshoot. But other pathways, before we reach to 2100, there would be an increase in the global temperature above 1.5. The more you go above the 1.5, the more you would need to rely on technologies. So, and we even say, the negative emissions and so on. So obviously the IPCC relies first, or the pathways rely first on CDR, which is to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. But also although the pathways they assessed have not really included solar radiation modification, we see that, especially for the stratosphere aerosol injection, we see that there is high agreement that it could contribute to, getting us reach the 1.5 by the end of the century. So these discussions are necessary because we don't know which path we are going to follow. Hopefully, we would follow a path where we would not need to have large-scale CDR or large-scale, SRM, which is really the last resource from what we have studied so far in the pathways. So the issue that comes around, not so much around CDR, because I think we know more about CDR, but obviously it also needs governance. There are governance issues to some of the methods being introduced there as well. But for solar radiation, the issue of the governance is most needed because, it's really hard to see that most of the research that we have on solar radiation management is concentrated on developed countries. Most of it. And potentially, the countries that might be affected or be affected by the risks of the deployment of SRM would be the developing countries and the small island states. So their early engagement into this conversation would be fantastic. Now, which conversation is this? I see them as twofold. A conversation on the governance of research, bringing them as part of those that are engaged, because then they would understand the uncertainties, they would be able to cope with that or not, they would understand potential risks, in particular, changes in precipitation that might affect their, because these risks are not distributed evenly in the globe. So bringing them, developing countries, the more we do that, the more I think we would be able to make them understand the risks and also the benefits. There would be benefits potentially, because you would alleviate the risks of climate change. So anyway, which comes first? I think we need to discuss these technologies because we don't know which pathway we're going to follow. So we need to have governance of research, bringing, as many developing countries organizations as we could. We should engage, as the Ipcc says about the governance, you should engage not levels of governance, but you should engage civil society. You should engage, there is a publication that mentions that potentially concerns of the indigenous people could be particularly at risk. You normally do not engage, this. And Ipcc in the governance definition really brings everybody. It's a more inclusive concept of governance where everybody would have an opportunity to understand deeply the implications and the benefits of in particular, solar radiation modification. So I think these things should come, basically simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Arunabha.
The longest.
That's right. Arunabha, please.
Thank you, Kai-Uwe. I think this question is a very important one, and I'm going to just pick up from what Jesse was saying, that I think sometimes we create these false dichotomies or binaries between, is it mitigation or SRM or adaptation or CDR? And the same applies to this question of establishing a false binary between technology development or governance. To me, it is fairly obvious that both have to go together. The reason we get into the binary is we think that while technology has nuances in its evolutionary stage, governance is either zero or an overarching international architecture that constrains any kind of scientific freedom. But there's nuance in governance as well. In my writings, I've articulated that we can consider at least 4 different governance routes. You can have ad hoc principles and codes of conduct, which on one hand gives you flexibility. It's led by the stakeholders, but it of course has the downside because you don't know who is then deciding these codes of conduct. Is there a conflict of interest between scientists doing the science as well as coming up with their codes of conduct? And therefore, there's a second route, that could there be national level governance? The advantage is that you can speedily bring this within the framework of governance of science within a particular jurisdiction. You respect the sovereignty of countries. But as I was arguing earlier, there are many elements of the uncertainties that require a level of international governance which will not be addressed here. So then we have a third route. Should we and could we adapt existing treaties? That would, again, give us some flexibility. It would be legitimate because these are established international regimes. But the downside or the demerit, again, is that these organizations or international regimes already have overburdened agendas. They might not have the specialized expertise to deal with SRN, and it would just complicate the governance process. Therefore, then we are left with the fourth option of, do we need to create new treaties together? When we think of governance, it's more important to ask ourselves, what is it that we are trying to govern? And in my mind, there are three things. You're trying to govern the research or the implementation. You're trying to govern the monitoring mechanism. And you're trying to govern any kind of disputes that might arise because of any kind of negative impacts that are seen. When we think of it, governance in a functional way, we can maybe then find national level governance is appropriate for managing the research and deployment, but maybe some kind of peer review or international mechanism is needed to look at the monitoring and the assessments, and maybe some kind of much more formal legalistic arrangement is needed to deal with disputes and enforcement of any kind of adjudication that is needed. So a functional division of governance actually makes it far more flexible enough to align with the way the science is evolving, rather than leave us in a binary of no governance or very constraining and restrictive governance.
Thank you, both Thelma and Arunabha. We have, I think, now very much addressed that question about technology prior to governance. There was this other question about where have it now? How can we engage without understanding the full experiment aspect of it? If anyone would want to react to that, just maybe again, I see a few more questions coming. Please, we have about 12 minutes left as per the original schedule. I'm not so sure as the panelists, you have 5 or 10 minutes more? Everyone? Okay, good. Then we extend it, so we probably can get more around. We can spend hours on this. Thank you very much for that. That's really, really, really much appreciated. So then maybe Shuchi, you want to react to that question about the border between experiment and implementation? I guess that's where it's aiming at.
Yeah, no, I think it's very true that there are a lot of uncertainties we won't be able to reduce until large-scale experimentation or deployment. But I think that also speaks to the fact that we need a lot more modeling research and small-scale research right now to try and figure out what uncertainties we can reduce. I think we've done quite a bit of modeling research, but nowhere near enough. We need a lot more. We need a lot more funding for modeling. And I think it's really important to invest in that now to see what questions arise that we haven't even thought of yet. And when it comes to small scale experiments, for example, like ScopeX, there's important information to gather from them that can then be put in those models. I'm not at all advocating for small scale experiments that would have, negative environmental impacts. But ScopeX, for example, would have a negligible impact if it were to proceed. And there's important information to gather around stratospheric chemistry, for example, which is an area that we have very low understanding of right now. For marine cloud brightening, we have a very low understanding of cloud physics. We really need to invest in this early stage research now to be able to figure out what uncertainties we can reduce and what uncertainties we haven't even thought of.
Thank you very much. Jesse.
Yeah, if I can add just a couple points. Just speaking in general, I agree with all three of the last responses, Thelma and Arunabha's comment on the relationship of governance and research, as well as Shuchi on the on experiments. I would emphasize, following up on the question about experimentation, that there are indeed lots of potential valuable experiments indoors and outdoors before a potential full-scale climate response test. And even at the physical level, we can think about the necessary engineering questions. Can the machinery and equipment do what we want it to do? Could we get aerosols into the stratosphere? Could we get a mist into the lower atmosphere above oceans that attract water droplets and serve as cloud condensation nuclei? And then there's a wide range of physical and environmental questions around what are the chemical, physical, and biological processes that happen locally around a potential SRM climate intervention. I would go a little further that there's also purposes of research that go beyond the generation of knowledge. And this is a broader social process that points towards how research can lead to collaboration and trust, especially in international settings, and especially as we move into, hopefully, the much needed North-South collaboration and research and scientific research that's conducted solely and centered in developing countries. This is a necessary process to get the type of global awareness that will be necessary for making governance decisions.
Thank you very much. I play the trick. We have actually another 40 minutes to go, so isn't this great? So we'll turn into, but it didn't trigger more questions. That's why I'm a little concerned. But I have a few in petto, and then we can also come back and react to the various questions from which we had no chance to react to yet, so to say. There's one question here which was quite interesting. Is we just have to refind it again. So some participants have the question around who may deploy SRM, and I think my hunch it's probably a stratospheric aerosol injection (SAI). Might it be commercialized, and what happens if someone unilaterally deploys without knowing how to conclude it, for example, how to end it? Anyone would like to react to that? Jesse.
Yeah, I can, if no one else wishes to dive in. Although there's been some speculation that private or non-state actors could deploy solar radiation modification, SRM, it seems remarkably unlikely that they would have the requisite finances to maintain it in a sustained way as opposed to some sort of short-term stunt. And B, it seems unlikely that countries, states, would tolerate private actors significantly modifying the global or even the local climate in any real way. So it seems to me that it's going to be countries, one or more countries, that will be involved in the deployment process. Now, within that, of course, we hope that this is done through a broader coalition rather than a narrow one. I think there's an analogy with the prospect of, let's say, a small so-called rogue state deploying solar geoengineering contrary to the wishes of the great powers. There's something of an analogy with that to the private actors. It just seems to me that this is the sort of activity that would require some degree of consensus and some degree of consent, at least unspoken or subtle consent from some of the relatively more powerful countries. But within that scope, I think there's a great range of possibilities as to which countries it might actually be and how many of them may be involved.
Thank you. Exactly what I was going to ask. Anyone have an immediate intervention or reaction? Thelma.
Yeah, I was, thanks, Jesse, for that. Yeah, I think that, getting to the final intervention from Jesse, I think that, with before deployment of SRM, I think that, the public acceptance of this will somehow be necessary. And so it is, there was one publication which I thought was interesting because it was assessing really the degree of rejection of solar radiation modification in several countries like Canada, China, Germany, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom, and also in the United States. And it's interesting to see the different countries, how the public reaction is to this, from absolutely not knowing about anything about it to knowing and having the different reactions. So even in the experiments in Germany, it says that laboratory work on solar radiation management is generally approved laboratory work. Field research, much less so. And immediate deployment, largely rejected. This is in Germany. So, and then obviously you're going to have, there is a long way, I would say, for us to understand and have a general feeling. And this is why, Kai, I think that, but this is personal, although the Ipcc does mention, where these issues could be addressed with the engagement of more countries. And I would say that this would be on the Climate Change Convention, under the subsidiary body of scientific and technological advice, the SUBSTA. Because at least, putting the seed on this topic that could also stimulate the research that we are looking for in different countries, right? Or coalitions of states that could, put together money, as it was already mentioned, money for modeling, because most of these things are going to have to be on modeling approach to understand potential impacts. I saw one of the questions that said, you talk about impacts, but you don't really say what these impacts could be. And I would mention that I think that and please others could compliment me on that, but I think that the most known potential risk of the SRM would be on precipitation. Changes in the precipitation, and these, as I have already mentioned, would not be distributed evenly. And also that I remember some potential impact on the ozone layer as well. But obviously, I think there is still a lot to understand on these potential risks. So I would say that really starting on this would be really to bring this to a body of discussion which would bring as many countries as possible. And so that could be also it could be on the biological diversity convention, which was, I think, the first one which expressed, I think that was in 2010, which expressed a view that, these technologies should not be deployed or even, research they stimulate, but not deployed if they could have impacts on biodiversity. I don't have the actual wordings here, but essentially it means the concern on potential implications on biodiversity from some of these approaches. So I think that I would stop here.
Thank you, Thelma. I think one of the questions I think links to that questions. I mean, you're talking governance, and we're talking about governance of using a particular set of technologies fundamentally, and we are focusing on what happens if we are introducing it, and we are focusing on why we are introducing it. But there's also the flip side of that question is, what if we don't? If we decide not to? There will be, I guess, similar governance challenges or problems which will be arising. And maybe if the one or the other has a thought around this, imagining the world based on the Ipcc projections and our, I think, track record globally in terms of being able to reach the transformational changes you were referring to, Thelma, what kind of governance challenges will we be facing in that context? And I guess the question is, how are these things connected, and how they are connected, maybe that thinking to questions like, isn't nature-based solutions better? Which was one of the questions. Aren't nature-based solutions better because they have impacts on biodiversity? We have a better understanding of that. But if I hear you and the conversations going, it is not necessarily anymore a question whether or not in terms of the carbon dioxide removal questions, it's not a question whether or not to do them, but a choice of which ones or a combination. I think you just made this point. It's a much more nuanced, and you also are now. But all our issues are not the black and white like our, I think, world and communications try to go a black and white world. It's a grayish world, or let's say colorful world, whatever you want to call it. That these are there. We have to operate in nuances. So I think that's what I see coming out of some of the questions which we have here. And what are your views of how to deal with how what are your thoughts around the fact that not considering, not talking, not thinking about these technologies, whether they can be done or not be done, and what the implications are. What is the flip side of that thinking? Maybe you have thoughts around what governance chance will be out there in case we will not be able to reach 1.6, 1.7, 1.8 degree, because our response in terms of transforming our behaviors and economic thinking in that transformation as required and indicated by Ipcc. And I think, Thelma, let me make this point. Ipcc is not a body saying what it is, but is actually collecting of what the view of many out there is, trying to identify the knowledge trends and understanding out there, because often we portray Ipcc as this kind of organization which does the work. It collects the work. It does this fantastic analytical work, which is very, very important. And I think that's so. Sorry, I said a few things which probably created many questions, but I think the key point is, I think, about this, is it either or, and what if not kind of question. If somebody would like to react to that and how to deal with that.
I'd just like to make a quick comment on something you said earlier in your statement. And it's that, regardless of what outcomes you might want for solar geoengineering, those outcomes require governance. And talking about governance is incredibly important. I think often people who talk about solar geoengineering governance get painted as advocates for solar geoengineering or for solar geoengineering research. But talking about governance, I think, is the responsible way forward, regardless of what outcome you may want. And I just really want to emphasize that point because it often gets overlooked.
Thank you. Arunabha?
Yes, I think...
go ahead.
Sure, Thelma. Kai, I think I mentioned earlier that I've been engaged in this conversation for 10 years. But 10 years ago also, I was arguing, as Thelma is also saying, and as Shuchi is saying, that we need to have many more voices around the table. It's, again, because we think that having voices around the table automatically results in cacophony, that we avoid any voices around the table. And we've lost 10 years. And as Jesse was saying earlier, what have we achieved in terms of emissions reduction in the last 10 years? So the importance about governance starts with, whose voice counts. And when you ask that question, there is enough precedence to engender or engage with different types of communities at different levels of governance to bring voices in. That's exactly what democracies are. I mean, what you discuss with a mayor of a small town is different from what you discuss with your national legislator. And it's different from what you discuss at the UN General Assembly. So that's exactly how we need to think about it. There's a question here which didn't come on, it came in the chat box about, that technologies have always developed, and once we've found their downsides, then we've thought of governance. That might be the case for a few things, but that's not the case all the time. And there are cases where international research has been conducted with governance architecture in place. Take, for instance, international agriculture research that went on from the late 1960s and continues even now across developing and developed countries, and it had very clear governance mechanisms. If you think of responsibility and liability of some things that could go wrong, there are very clear, explicit clauses around this associated with, say, CERN, which is based in Switzerland and France, but has scientific contributions from many countries. If you think about intellectual property and access to data, the Human Genome Program prioritizes getting the data out in the public domain rather than holding onto the data for private gain. If you think about the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, again, something that has many countries involved in it, there's royalty-free access to the information and the data and the results for the participating members. So when we begin to actually look around, you see that there are those building blocks of governance actually exist. The mental barrier that we haven't been able to overcome is the most simple question about why are we so hesitant in having more voices around the table?
Thank you. Thelma, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to say that, I really would appreciate it. It is easy to say, but it's difficult to implement. How do we bring this into under the umbrella of an international governance? And why do I say that? I say that because when you bring the subject to be discussed internationally, and where you have all the diversity of countries that might be affected differently, you can also come with a different approaches. For instance, you would say that for some of the approaches under the umbrella of the solar radiation management, you could have this, that, and then others would not be contemplated, or you would stimulate some and not others. The IPCC does say that, as we have already said, I think everybody agrees with that, despite being the most researched, approach, the stratosphere, aerosol injection, it is also the one that, overall could have an impact into really contributing to limiting global warming to 1.5. There are other approaches, like the ground-based albedo modification, marine cloud brightening, which has also been mentioned. These might be able to not really have a great contribution to reduce the overall global temperature, but they might help to mitigate regional climate impacts. So all these things, I think, that deserve a nice forum for discussion. So even though they are not going to be, with a huge effect for the global decrease in temperature, but they could have regionally an importance into addressing the impacts. Kai, you mentioned the nature-based solutions, which I see more under the umbrella of the carbon dioxide removal than, completely different from this discussion here. But, those would be the approaches that potentially would be first implemented in large scale, like afforestation, reforestation, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, all these in large scale if necessary. So, and then other approaches like solar radiation management. I think it would come only to be implemented. I think it's the last resort, to tell you the truth. So hopefully. But I am an optimistic by nature. Countries would understand that both carbon capture, CO2, carbon dioxide removal, and solar radiation management, hopefully they would not be necessary. I think that CDR, the carbon dioxide removal, is in all the pathways that IPCC have assessed, but not SRM, I already mentioned. But hopefully there will be such an ambitious mitigation and adaptation effort that we might not have the need to rely on either large scale CDR or to solar radiation modification. I think that this is going to be the last resort, really, which doesn't mean we don't have to study it. But I hope really that we don't have, as we have mentioned, the moral hazard, countries really thinking that technology will do everything, because this would be the worst path that we could have in terms of thinking, how do we move ahead into addressing climate change? So responsibility should be focused on mitigation ambitious and not on technologies.
Mm-hmm. Jess, I see that you are unmuted. You want to come in?
Yes, briefly, this builds somewhat on what Thelma said. I sincerely hope that I have a future, my son has a future in which SRM is not needed. My sense is that the chance of that is relatively, the chance that it wouldn't be beneficial, or that the chance that climate change will not exceed 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C is fairly low. People of good faith can differ on their assessment of that probability. But in all such scenarios, I think it's safe to say that having done the SRM research and having discussed and developed the international governance required to pursue SRM research and potentially to use SRM would be better than not doing the research and developing the governance. Because closing our eyes to the possibility doesn't make the probability that it may be needed go away.
Thank you very much. I wanted to bring up. We have one question which got a vote by someone, so I want to have this on the table. So this question is around. There are concerns that the military will control and weaponize the climate and weather. Can we trust nations that have the greatest military power? Question mark. Does U.S. recent track record of not signing international agreements cause concern about U.S. special case? It's a concern. It got a vote, so I thought I throw it in. You might not want to react to that, but I leave this up to you. I wanted to make it also a second point, which I found interesting in terms of it was less a question, but about it was a question about the representation of views in here, in that sense that there is no currently does not include participants who hold a negative perspective on SRM. I felt what I've heard is that I don't think we have people who have necessarily positive views either in this call, but it's a valid point, and I should say we try and we have tried, and we have also thoughts about how to deal with the fact that in order to understand views, we can't have everyone on the panel. We're thinking of recording different views and making them available as well. So in that sense, from our perspective, we're going to try and go down that road. So hence, we don't have maybe a negative perspective in here as the one or the several participants might think about, but we would definitely, they're important voices, they have concerns, they have thoughts, so they need to be addressed. And Jesse, you and Thelma, you came from your perspective of what you think about what you would hope for going forward. But let me then come back to the question about militarization and the trust that, and I would not necessarily make it a nation-specific thing, but the trust that we can develop an international system that can contain what is otherwise called a rock player or a single deployment by a nation state. I believe this would be stratospheric aerosol injection and not something as a large deployment of marine cloud brightening, for example. But who would like to react to that question about militarization and threat?
I'll react to one part of the question, which was about the U.S. and the Trump administration, which I saw in the question. And I do think who funds this kind of research is a really important point. I don't think the Trump administration should be funding solar geoengineering research. I think it should come only from entities that unequivocally support mitigation adaptation. I completely agree with that sentiment. And I think that should be true of all nations or all foundations or all organizations that fund solar geoengineering research too. And so the military arm is part of the U.S. government. So I don't think the military should be involved at all, regardless of administration, but right now, especially, because we are not supporting mitigation adaptation at the scales that we should. I think the concern around militarization has been talked about quite a bit. I think right now, at least in my view, I don't think military involvement is a deep concern in this early stage of research. But I do think that's why governance conversations are so important to start having now. It's to build structures around transparency and openness and public engagement to prevent this kind of military scenario that we want to prevent. And I think that public engagement component, I know I keep talking about it, but I think that's why it's so incredibly important to have those diversity of voices and openness and understanding of this topic to be able to prevent that kind of problem.
Thank you very much. I just want to check with Arunabha. I have the information that you might have to leave earlier, so I want to make sure that you have you can come in before I give somebody else the floor, because I think you will have to leave for a major lecture. So we thank you for having been pushing it to this very last moment. But over to you.
Thank you, Kai-Uwe. Yes, this is something that keeps coming up as a question, whether there is the potential for military abuse of an otherwise, very differently oriented technology. But this is not the first time the militaries might do that. And it's not the first time the technologies might have emerged in the military and then applied to civilian use. The question here is not about whether a technology can be put to more malign users rather than benign users. That is human nature. It's likely to happen. The question is, what do you need to reduce the probability of those things happening? When we raise the question about can we trust nations, we are always left in a bind that to trust nations, we need international regimes that kind of, at least at some level, tie our hands behind our backs. But at the same time, we also know there is no world government, and therefore the most powerful countries in the world will still go ahead and do something, which is where the question of moral suasion comes in. Even authoritarian countries around the world call themselves democratic republics because there is a moral basis for calling yourself representative, even if you're not. This is why, again, we need to have many more actors around the table. Because to assume that the military of one country might want to take control of the technology should not mean that every citizen in that country condones that kind of an action. And therefore, again, if you have national governance in terms of managing the research, international assessments of the research, and eventually an international architecture to manage and deal with disputes and potentially negative outcomes that might emerge, then you at least have built an architecture that gives you a higher probability of pushing back against misuse. It does not guarantee it, but it's certainly better than just assuming or imagining the worst, but simply hoping for the best.
Thank you, Arunabha. Thelma, I think you were trying to come in before. I'm not so sure. I just want to make sure.
No,
Okay.
Then if we have a chance, I was looking at the questions. There is someone that was asking, because Jesse in his first intervention have mentioned about the Ipcc producing a special report on solar radiation modification. And and then if you think it's suitable for us to address this, please let me know.
Go ahead.
Okay.
That's why we have this.
Yeah, it is interesting because, normally the Ipcc has the big assessment reports that takes 5-6 years to be published. And the special reports are done in a much shorter time. But normally the special reports are proposed by the countries themselves, right? Because it's an intergovernmental panel. So this year, I think we went beyond our capacity, producing 3 special reports. One was the 1.5 special report, and another one on ocean, and another one on land. It was interesting to see that the 1.5 special report came from an invitation from the Climate Change Convention. So it's unusual. It's very unusual that the convention asks the Ipcc to produce something. And this time, there was a lot of pressure about trying to understand the impacts of global warming of 1.5 and how could we get to 1.5 at the end of the century. So this came from the convention itself. So we produced 3 special reports in addition to the assessment reports, which will come in a couple of years' time. which was really a heavy, load. Now, having said that, so we would have two ways of potentially having one special report in the next cycle that starts in 2023. Either an invitation from the climate change, convention. That could be interesting. It's an invitation, and that the IPCC, in fact, in the panel analyzes that and accepts it or not. Usually it accepts, right? And the other one is to have this spontaneous request from some governments when the next cycle starts. And then by consensus, everyone agrees that that's going to be one report. Obviously, Jesse was absolutely right that the inclusion of SRM in the next assessment report is limited because we have a certain amount of pages that we have to, abide to. But honest, I think that it's going to be a quite difficult request to be accepted by consensus. Now it's my personal view, because developing countries would not like to push possibly into discussing technologies with the fear of the moral hazard, which we mentioned so many times here. That as a means to say, so this is feasible or not feasible. We don't know what would come up from the special report. But I think that it would be quite a good discussion, among the countries to have a consensual agreement that this special report should be produced. I myself would think that it would be beneficial, really, to understand what's the science that we have so far. And IPCC is really the good place to do this assessment of the global literature, scientific literature, all the modeling, all the things that are going on. So anyway, but let's have hope. Maybe someone comes with that proposal. We don't know. We have still 2 years to think about it. Yeah. But thanks for the question, and thanks, Jesse, for indicating that it would be a good way forward.
Jesse, you raised your hand. Okay. We have just a quick one. We have about 7 minutes left. So, and then maybe we come to closure slowly. But Jesse first, and then
just a quick point. I of course think that a special report from the IPCC on SRM would be helpful. I'm not so, although I share some degree of skepticism that it would sail through an intergovernmental panel by consensus. I'm not so sure that it would be that the roadblock would be developing countries who are concerned that it would take the pressure off of mitigation. And the reason that I say that is if you look at the introduction of a proposed decision at the UN Environment Assembly in March of last year in 2019. This was a draft resolution led by Switzerland and co-sponsored by about a dozen countries, diverse countries, both developing and industrialized countries. Some of the developing countries were highly vulnerable to climate change, and it suggested conversations toward thinking about both governance and a scientific assessment of both SRM and carbon removal. Now, this was a bit of a contentious discussion, and the decision was not approved. But as far as I know, none of the resistance was around the moral hazard concern. But in fact, some of the resistance was saying, no, scientific assessment of CDR and SRM is the province of the IPCC, not UNEA. And there were some other reasons for disagreement among the countries, but if anything, the sense there was that scientific assessment could and should be done by the IPCC.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jesse. I would suggest, as we have only 5 minutes left, if you can just have the last kind of thought which each of you have, maybe starting with Shuchi and then Jesse, Thelma, and I think then we will wrap up. There there were one or two more questions which I think will not have the time to deal with. I hope we have done justice to those who asked questions, and we'll hope that it won't be the last conversation, the last opportunity of asking questions. Please note that the webinars, which the complement to this exercise, is going to come online soon, and there will be up to 4 Q&A sessions, if you wish, between now and the end of the year or the beginning of next year, where we will then have the ability to hopefully address some of those other questions as well. With that, maybe Jesse, your first last thoughts today in this setting. Thank you.
My last thoughts for today. First, thank C2G as the panelists and the audience for making this a success and for having me among the invited speakers. I find it interesting how often the questions and comments from the audience are understandably oriented towards, shall we say, long-range concerns around SRM. How might it be implemented? How might climate response tests play out? Would this potentially be militarized? Those are relevant concerns. I hope that they don't take our attention away from the short-term issues at stake. And I've emphasized, for example, the need for authoritative international scientific assessment. I'd add 2 more things to that. The first of which is the need, and I implied this earlier, to increase the scale of research. SRM research has remained just a few $1 million per year worldwide for the last decade or so. And the second is the need to internationalize this research, potentially to developing countries, both collaborations among teams of North and South, as well as more research in developing countries so that they can have the in-house expertise to engage with the international discussions that will be taking place one way or another in the upcoming years.
Thank you, Jesse. Shuchi?
Thank you, Kai, and thank you to C2G for having me as well. I really enjoyed this event and, talking with all my panelists and responding to all the questions. And yeah, I mean, my final thoughts are just that these conversations are so important. We need to engage more people. We need to answer these questions. And I'm so glad that, people in this field are willing to engage in these kinds of open discussions. I think we need more of them. And to build on what Jesse was saying, I think research governance is incredibly important right now to pay attention to, both in terms of facilitation for modeling, but also in terms of oversight and transparency for potential atmospheric experiments. And as we talk more about atmospheric experiments, starting to grow the conversation, what that can mean, it becomes more real to people. It is a tangible touchstone. And so I think we do need to acknowledge that and start, having much broader discussions and a lot more places for public input. And so, yes, I'll stop there. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you for joining, Shuchi. Thelma?
Yeah, thanks, Kai. Yeah, it was a nice discussion. Obviously, in the time frame that we had, potentially we didn't address everything that potentially those that are watching us would like us to address. But anyway, I see that we have a good understanding of where the challenges lie. And I would like to reinforce basically 2 issues that the Ipcc does acknowledge that all these uncertainties that are surrounding the SRM approaches, including the technology maturity or immaturity, I would say here, the physical understanding, the impact potential, and the challenges to governance really constrain the implementation of SRM in the near future. The other point that I would like to stress to leave the message is that really the avoidance that we should have in terms of the risk of unequal representation or the deliberate exclusion of countries or organizations or stakeholders in the decision-making process on solar radiation management. So I think that we talked about the inclusiveness which IPCC in the definition of governance so much reinforces. So that's basically my last message here: inclusiveness in this discussion, both in research and the decision making.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone, including Arunabha, who is still who has left for his lecture. Thank you for all of you joining and sharing your thoughts and thinking with the audience and with us. Learned a bit as well again. So this was a very interesting exercise. Thank you again for that. I think with this, I don't want to kind of summarize and conclude. I think I hope that we achieved the objective of sharing a little bit of how people think and approach the subject matter. What are the key factors for moving forward for all of these persons here around the table? And just to note, this is recorded. You can, this can be downloaded in the future and watched again and again. And with that, I would one more time. I can't get a stop here. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. And I'm sure we're seeing each other again in one or the other area. Yeah. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.